The police officers laughed at her address and considered her to be an ordinary resident. But just a few minutes later, their confidence collapsed when the doors of the police station swung open and the military entered. What happened next turned the city upside down. Watch until the end to find out the truth. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The streets of Eastbridge carried the weight of a history written in cracked pavement and weathered brick. Street lamps flickered as if reluctant to stay lit, casting faint pools of light that barely reached the uneven sidewalks. The scent of fried food and sweet bread drifted from corner shops that were still open, while faded murals painted years ago told stories of resilience that had long been ignored by the city council. On these streets, children played until dusk turned to night, their laughter echoing between old apartment buildings. Yet beneath that surface of life, an air of unease lingered. People had grown cautious, glancing over their shoulders, slowing their steps when passing patrol cars that seemed to linger longer here than anywhere else. At the heart of this neighborhood stood a modest grocery store, one that had been there for decades. It belonged to Ellie Cole, a woman whose spirit was stronger than the cracks in the old linoleum floor she swept every evening. The store smelled faintly of spices and detergent, of fruits stacked neatly in wooden crates, and of bread that never stayed long enough on the shelves to go stale. For the community, it was more than a store. It was a gathering place, a constant, a landmark where people exchanged news, worries, and brief moments of hope. Ellie had been the one holding it all together, with her persistence and steady hands, but the weight of years was beginning to bend her shoulders. That evening, her daughter, Amara Cole, helped her close up. The sound of the broom scratching across the floor was steady, punctuated by the quiet hum of the old refrigerator that had outlasted 2 repairmen and several promises of replacement. Amara's military posture remained even in the simple act of stacking cans on the shelves, her movements precise, controlled. She had seen battlefields, commanded soldiers, and navigated international crises. But here, in her mother's store, she was simply a daughter, returning to the place that shaped her. She looked around and remembered herself as a child running between these aisles, hiding behind the counter when customers came in, watching her mother work long hours to make sure food stayed on the table. Ellie's eyes were sharp despite the fatigue etched into her face. She scolded Amara for working too hard, reminding her that she had just come back from long service. But beneath the words lay pride, deep and unspoken, that her daughter had risen to ranks few women and fewer black women ever achieved. For Amara, helping close the store was a small way of repaying a lifetime of sacrifices. Outside, the city was restless. In recent weeks, rumors spread faster than the neon light could buzz above Eastbridge's liquor stores. People whispered about new checkpoints set up by the police, supposedly for public safety. But everyone knew the truth. These barricades were not about safety. They were about control. Families complained of being stopped every day on their way to work or school. Young men had been pulled out of cars for random searches. Elderly women returning from church were delayed and humiliated. And yet those living in the wealthier suburbs spoke of checkpoints as if they were rumors, inconveniences that never touched them. The lines between the neighborhoods were being drawn sharper every day, invisible but heavy, as though the very geography had been weaponized. Inside the store, a neighbor stopped by before closing, speaking in a hushed tone about how his son had been forced to stand for nearly an hour at one of those stops, even though no violation had occurred. Another neighbor said her groceries had spoiled in the car while she waited for an officer to let her through. Each story carried the same rhythm of injustice, the same tired acceptance that nothing would change. Amara listened, her jaw tightening, committing every detail to memory. She said little, but her silence was deliberate. Years in uniform had taught her the power of listening first, acting later. As the night grew heavier, Ellie finished balancing the day's receipts, her pen scratching over the ledger with care. She insisted she would finish the numbers before leaving. Amara offered to drive her home, but Ellie waved her away. She wanted to linger in the store, to tie up her own routines. With a reluctant nod, Amara accepted. Knowing her mother's stubbornness was an unmovable force, the same quality that had carried them through the hardest years. Amara stepped outside, the cool air brushing her face as she locked her car doors. She paused for a moment, looking back through the glass of the store's front window. Her mother was there, hunched over the counter, absorbed in her work. It was a familiar image, one that had defined her childhood. She smiled faintly, though unease tugged at the edge of her thoughts. Something about the night felt different, as if the streets themselves were bracing for an unseen shift. Driving away, Amara noticed how quickly Eastbridge transformed into the borderlands that led toward the suburbs. Street after street bore the scars of neglect, but beyond them lay Greenfield, the polished neighborhood of clean lawns and bright storefronts. The contrast was jarring, a visible reminder of the divide that dictated who was seen and who was overlooked. The hum of her old sedan's engine filled the silence as she approached the intersection that separated the two worlds. It was there that the glow of flashing blue and red lights cut across her windshield. Ahead, traffic slowed to a crawl. A makeshift checkpoint had been set up, with patrol cars parked in staggered formation, their lights casting garish patterns across the asphalt. Metal barricades funneled vehicles into a single lane, where uniformed officers stood waiting. Some cars rolled through quickly, waved past with a flick of the hand. Others were pulled aside, their drivers ordered to exit. From where she sat, Amara saw a pattern. White drivers breezed through without pause. While black drivers were delayed, their cars searched. The tension in the air was thick, as though everyone knew what was happening, but no one dared speak it aloud. A young man in the car ahead lifted his phone to record, only to have an officer stride over and demand he put it away. Another driver, an elderly woman, sat with her hands gripping the wheel, fear etched in every line of her face. Amara's training kept her movements deliberate. She rolled down her window halfway, placed her license and registration neatly on the passenger seat, and turned on her hazard lights. Every gesture was measured, designed to convey calm compliance. She knew the script officers expected. She had lived through far more dangerous standoffs than this, yet the thought of being treated like a suspect in her own city gnawed at her. One of the officers approached, his flashlight beam slicing through the interior of her car. His nameplate caught the light. Officer Jared Miller. He studied her license for longer than necessary, his eyes narrowing when he reached the line with her address. His lips twisted slightly as he repeated the word Eastbridge into his radio. A second officer emerged from the command vehicle. This one moved with the air of authority, his presence heavy, Captain Ronald Davis. His hand hovered near his holster as he stepped closer, his eyes sweeping across Amara with a mixture of suspicion and disdain. The exchange was not the neutral verification she had expected. It was an interrogation masked as routine procedure. Miller smirked as he handed Davis the license, muttering something under his breath. Davis studied it, then ordered her to step out of the vehicle. His tone held no courtesy, only the sharp edge of command wielded without respect. Amara breathed deeply, opened her door, and rose slowly. Every movement was deliberate, her posture upright, her face calm. Her military instincts told her to resist the provocation, to play the long game. She noted every detail, the angle of Davis's stance, the way Miller's hand tightened on his flashlight, the way other cars were hurriedly waved through once the officers decided to focus on her. Her refusal to react only seemed to inflame their determination. They began searching her car without cause, muttering to each other about people from Eastbridge always hiding something. The procedure was aggressive, unjustified, and in violation of every law she knew. She could have spoken, could have asserted her rights, but she held her silence, letting them dig their own hole deeper. When Davis finally ordered Miller to cuff her, she offered no resistance. The metal bit into her wrists, too tight, deliberate in its cruelty. Her body flinched, but her gaze remained steady, fixed on the horizon. The moment the cuffs snapped shut, Amara knew the night had crossed a threshold. She had come here as a daughter helping her mother close a store. Now she was being led into the machinery of a system designed to break those who refused to bow. She kept her back straight as they shoved her toward the cruiser, her mind already cataloging every word, every face, every abuse. The city around her kept moving, cars driving past, people watching from behind closed windows. But for Amara Cole, the mission had begun, and the path she was about to walk would change everything. The car door slammed behind her with a finality that seemed to echo in the hollow night. The stale air of the cruiser pressed against her, carrying with it the faint odor of sweat and old coffee. Amara sat upright, the steel cuffs biting into her wrists, her body held taut with composure even as Officer Miller's voice carried forward from the driver's seat. He muttered comments about Eastbridge residents, his tone mocking, and Captain Davis responded with short grunts of approval. To them, she was not a woman who had spent decades in service, not a four-star general who had commanded operations on foreign soil. She was just another black driver with an address they deemed suspect. Every word they exchanged became part of the silent record she was storing in her memory. Each inflection, another layer of proof. The drive to the station was not long, yet every second stretched out with a heavy clarity. Through the window she could see the blurred lights of Greenfield, the wealthier district whose immaculate sidewalks and polished storefronts seemed like a world away from Eastbridge. Cars moved freely on those streets, free of checkpoints, free of suspicion. The divide had never felt starker. She leaned her head back against the hard seat, her eyes steady, her mind rehearsing not what she might say, but what she needed to observe. This was no longer an inconvenience. It was the stage for something larger, something she had expected but not anticipated so soon. The cruiser pulled into the lot of the station, the building looming with its harsh, fluorescent lighting and concrete walls. As she was led inside, the sounds enveloped her, the buzz of overhead lamps, the heavy tread of boots on linoleum, the shrill ring of telephones ignored by officers leaning against desks. The station smelled of bleach, sweat, and the faint trace of smoke that clung to uniforms after long shifts. On the wall hung a bulletin board lined with mugshots, faces marked with weariness and fear. Most of them were black, some barely more than children. It was a gallery of humiliation meant to remind those who passed through what kind of people the system wanted on display. They brought her to the processing desk, where a tired officer barely looked up from his computer. Her name was asked, her address repeated, and when Eastbridge was spoken aloud, the man's expression hardened, as though the word itself justified suspicion. He pressed her thumb onto the scanner, the black ink bleeding across her skin, then gestured curtly toward the camera. The flash lit her face, stark and unflinching, her expression calm, her posture unbowed. To the officers watching from the corner, her composure was a provocation. They wanted fear, submission, something that confirmed the story they had already written about her. They would not get it. Behind her, Davis and Miller laughed openly, their voices carrying across the room. "Another one from that neighborhood," Miller said with deliberate volume, his gaze sliding over her. "They always think they're special." Davis chuckled in response, adding that some people needed to be reminded of their place. Around them, other officers smirked or looked away, complicit through silence. Amara absorbed it all, cataloging their words, their faces, their badge numbers. Evidence was everywhere, if one knew how to hold it. Then the sound of footsteps shifted the air. The station doors opened to admit Victor Langford, a man whose presence was felt before his words. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, and on his finger gleamed a championship ring that caught the light with each gesture. He moved with the authority of someone accustomed to power, a member of the city council whose reach extended far beyond municipal concerns. Officers straightened subtly as he entered, his eyes sweeping the room with calculated indifference until they landed on her. Davis moved quickly to brief him, his voice lowering but not enough to conceal the message. The woman had resisted, had argued about rights, had dared to question. Langford's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied her through the glass of the processing area. Then he dismissed the details with a casual wave. "Make sure she learns a lesson," he said, his tone smooth but carrying the weight of command. "We can't have residents thinking they can challenge the checkpoint program. The program is too important." The message was clear. Her arrest was not about legality, but about demonstration. She was to be an example, a warning to anyone else who might resist. Davis nodded eagerly, Miller smirked, and the machinery of false reports began to turn. At a side desk, papers were drafted, lines filled with fabricated details of resistance, obstruction, defiance. It was all routine, a script well rehearsed, and no one in the room raised a voice against it. For them, it was business as usual. Amara was escorted down a narrow corridor, the echo of her footsteps mingling with the slam of doors and the hum of fluorescent lights. The holding cell was small, its walls lined with peeling paint and its single bench cold to the touch. The air smelled of disinfectant layered over years of sweat and despair. They unlocked the door, shoved her inside, and let it clang shut behind her. Alone now, she sat on the bench, her back straight, her eyes steady. She thought of her mother, still at the store, unaware of what had transpired. She thought of the neighbors who had shared their fears that very evening, and she thought of the countless others who had sat in similar cells, voiceless, powerless, waiting for outcomes determined by men like Davis and Langford. But Amara was not powerless. Beneath the cuff of her sleeve, hidden in the lining of her watch, was a device designed for moments exactly like this. With a small, discreet motion of her thumb, she pressed the button that activated the communicator. A signal pulsed outward, reaching the Pentagon in an instant, marking her location, confirming her status. Protocol was clear. A response team would mobilize. Their timeline precise. 43 minutes. That was how long she needed to hold, how long she needed to wait. She leaned back against the wall, feeling the hard chill of concrete against her shoulders. The noise of the station filtered faintly through the door laughter, footsteps, the rustle of papers, but she no longer listened with ears alone. Every sound became part of her calculation, every moment another piece in a larger puzzle. She had trained for endurance, for resistance, for holding ground under pressure. This was not a battlefield of guns and artillery. It was one of words, of laws twisted and perverted, of power abused in fluorescent-lit rooms. And here, just as on any battlefield, her discipline would be her weapon. Time passed slowly, each minute marked by the ticking of the clock on the wall outside. Officers walked by her cell, some glancing in with smirks, others ignoring her entirely. She sat unmoving, her posture steady, refusing to grant them even the satisfaction of discomfort. The cuffs dug deeper into her wrists, leaving marks that burned with each pulse of her heartbeat. But she endured without a flinch. She knew the pain was temporary. What mattered was the record she was silently building, the truth she was carrying until reinforcements arrived. Back in the main office, Langford spoke in low tones with Davis, gesturing animatedly as he emphasized the importance of control. To him, the checkpoints were not merely about stopping crime. They were about property values, about reshaping the city into an image that excluded the likes of Eastbridge. He had promised investors a revitalized neighborhood, free of what he called undesirable elements. The checkpoints were the tool, the arrests the evidence, and the fear the weapon. Amara's detention was simply another step in his plan. But in the cell, Amara allowed herself the faintest of smiles. He had underestimated her. He thought she was just another resident caught in his net, another statistic to fill his reports. He did not know who she was, what she represented, or what 43 minutes would bring. The silence of the cell was not defeat. It was preparation. Justice was moving, unseen but unstoppable, and it was coming directly to the heart of the Greenfield police station. The clock read 9:17 p.m. Amara closed her eyes briefly, drawing in a steady breath. 43 minutes, that was all. The air inside the holding cell was stale, heavy with a mix of metal, sweat, and the faint undertone of disinfectant that could not mask the years of despair that clung to the walls. Amara sat upright on the narrow bench, her hands still bound, her posture steady despite the sharp bite of the cuffs cutting into her wrists. The echo of voices filtered through the walls, muffled but distinct enough for her trained ears to separate words, tones, and intent. She knew the clock was ticking. By now, the signal she had sent would have reached the Pentagon. A countdown had begun, and though no one in this station knew it, the 43 minutes would end with their world turned inside out. The corridor outside came alive with footsteps, heavier than before. The door creaked, and for the first time since her arrival, a new face appeared. Detective Rafael Ortiz stepped in, carrying the aura of a man who did not quite fit the mold of the others in the building. His dark suit bore the neat professionalism of someone who still believed in procedure, his eyes sharper than most, observant, restless. He had been transferred to this department only months earlier, and already he had begun to see the cracks in the system. Tonight, those cracks were splitting open. Ortiz looked at the papers in his hand and frowned. The reports drafted by Captain Davis and Officer Miller spoke of resistance, aggression, obstruction. Yet something about the narrative failed to align with what he had observed during the night. He had seen many false reports in his career, but rarely had they been this sloppy, this careless. Details contradicted each other, timelines blurred, and the tone reeked of prejudice barely disguised as procedure. He was used to reading between lines, and here the story screamed fabrication. When he glanced through the bars at Amara, something in her bearing unsettled him. She did not shrink back or lash out. She sat with the quiet discipline of someone accustomed to pressure, her eyes steady, her body still. He had served in the army before joining the police force, and he knew that posture. He recognized the weight of someone who carried command, even when stripped of context. It was not bravado. It was the kind of composure honed by years of responsibility, by training that never left the bones. He asked to see her belongings, and when her identification was placed before him, the room seemed to tilt. The military ID bore the insignia of a 4-star general in the United States Marine Corps. Ortiz examined it with the eye of someone who had once held similar credentials of his own, albeit on a far lesser scale. He checked the holographic seal, the microprint, the subtle watermark that could only be seen under ultraviolet light. Every detail confirmed authenticity. His heart quickened. If this ID was genuine, then the woman in the cell was not simply a resident of Eastbridge wrongfully detained. She was one of the highest-ranking officers in the nation. For a moment, Ortiz felt the tug of hesitation. He knew what it would mean to challenge the captain, to confront the councilman whose influence shaped careers in this city. But another memory surfaced, one that seared through his doubts. 3 months earlier, his brother had visited, a respected pediatric surgeon driving a well-kept car. He had been stopped at one of these same checkpoints, pulled from his vehicle, detained for hours without explanation. No charges were filed, no justification given. His brother had returned shaken, humiliated, stripped of the dignity his profession should have guaranteed. Ortiz had filed complaints, submitted evidence, followed every procedural channel, and each time the paperwork vanished, the complaints stamped resolved without investigation. The system had protected itself, not its citizens. Now here sat Amara Cole, her identity ignored, her rights trampled, her presence turned into a warning for an entire community. Ortiz felt the weight of choice pressing against him. He could continue to play the silent role, preserving his position, waiting for the storm to pass, or he could act, knowing that his actions would brand him an enemy to the very department that paid him. He moved closer to her cell, lowering his voice though the gesture was almost unnecessary. Her gaze locked with his, and in that moment he saw recognition. She knew who he was, not in name, but in principle. She had read him as clearly as he had read her. Without words, she conveyed the understanding that every choice mattered now, that truth required courage greater than silence. Ortiz slipped a small USB drive from his pocket, his fingers brushing the bars as he discreetly passed it to her. Within it lay weeks of quietly gathered evidence, internal memos about quotas, statistics that revealed racial targeting, intercepted communications that instructed officers to prioritize Eastbridge vehicles. He had collected them at great risk, unable to find an outlet that would listen. Now he realized he had found the person who could use them. Amara accepted it without reaction, tucking it into her sleeve with the same ease she might have once concealed classified orders. The gesture was small, but it carried the gravity of allegiance. In the main office, the mood had shifted. Phones rang more often, and Captain Davis grew increasingly tense as reports came in from dispatch. Someone had called the station asking about a General Cole. Another call followed, this time from a number traced to Washington. Officers glanced at one another, confusion flickering in their eyes, but Davis brushed it off as coincidence, insisting the calls were pranks. Yet when a third call came through, his composure began to falter. The name was known. The question repeated. Was she there? Langford arrived again, his voice sharp as he pressed Davis to handle the situation. His concern was not the truth, but the optics. the fear that news might spread before he could control it. He muttered about investors, about the importance of keeping the checkpoint program intact. Davis assured him that everything was under control, though the sheen of confidence was thinning, cracking at the edges. Back in the holding cell, Amara closed her eyes briefly, inhaling the steady rhythm of patience. She had trained to withstand interrogation, to hold silence against pressure far greater than this. She knew the shift was coming, that the balance of power was tilting. Evidence was already in motion, phone calls escalating, tension mounting. She had been waiting, counting each minute. The countdown was nearly at its end. When the doors of the station finally swung open with the echo of authority, the air changed. The rhythm of boots against tile filled the corridor, crisp and synchronized. Colonel Jackson entered, his uniform immaculate, flanked by military police whose presence silenced the room in an instant. Every officer in the station straightened unconsciously, their bravado shrinking under the weight of federal authority. Davis moved forward, his words stumbling as he attempted to assert jurisdiction. But Jackson cut him down with the calm authority of a man carrying orders from the Secretary of Defense. The station was no longer theirs to control. Amara was escorted from her cell, her wrists freed by hands that carried respect rather than contempt. She stood tall, her gaze sweeping the room, her silence more powerful than any words she could have spoken. Around her, officers, who had laughed hours before, now shifted uncomfortably, aware that their every action had been documented, their every violation soon to be judged. Langford tried to speak, to reframe the narrative as a misunderstanding, but Jackson's command silenced him. The councilman's power meant little in the presence of federal jurisdiction. Ortiz stepped forward, his eyes meeting Amara's once more. In that silent exchange, gratitude and resolve passed between them. He had risked everything, but in doing so, he had found the ally he needed. And in Amara Cole, he had delivered the evidence into hands that could not only wield it, but transform it into justice. The night had begun with a simple stop at a checkpoint, a ritual of humiliation dressed as safety. It now unfolded as the unraveling of a system built on lies and discrimination. As Amara walked through the station toward the conference room, now commandeered by the military, she carried with her the knowledge that the battle was no longer about her. It was about every voice silenced, every life disrupted, every injustice buried beneath paperwork. The system had believed it was unbreakable, but the system had underestimated her. The countdown was over. The operation had begun. The conference room of the Greenfield police station had been transformed into something unrecognizable. Only hours earlier, it had hosted briefings, routine paperwork, and the casual arrogance of men certain of their power. Now the air carried the electric weight of accountability. Rows of laptops hummed on tables, projectors illuminated the walls with charts and documents, and military personnel moved with efficiency, their presence unmistakably altering the rhythm of the building. Amara Cole stood at the center, no longer in the shadows of a holding cell, but at the head of a federal operation. Her wrists still bore the red marks left by the cuffs, reminders of the indignity she had endured. But her stance was unyielding, her eyes fixed on the men who had orchestrated the night's injustice. Captain Ronald Davis sat stiffly on one side of the table, his uniform suddenly seeming too small, his authority shrinking under the gaze of federal investigators. Officer Jared Miller leaned back in his chair, his bravado evaporating into nervous glances. And Victor Langford, the councilman who had strutted into the station with the confidence of untouchable power, now fidgeted with the edge of his cuff, his ring catching the light but offering no shield. They were no longer masters of the narrative. They were subjects of investigation, their every word and action preserved in records and testimony that now filled the room. Colonel Jackson's voice carried authority as he outlined the protocols in place. Evidence preservation was already underway. Every computer system in the station was being copied, every file logged, every camera footage secured. Teams of specialists moved through the halls collecting documents, downloading data, cataloging communications. No piece of information would be left to vanish quietly. The veneer of control that had protected the checkpoint program for months was stripped away, replaced by the hard scrutiny of federal oversight. Amara spoke then, her voice calm but resonant, filling the space with a clarity that could not be ignored. She presented the evidence piece by piece, beginning with the maps of checkpoint placements. The projection revealed a city cut into two, the neighborhoods of wealth left untouched, the streets of Eastbridge and similar communities saturated with barricades. The pattern was undeniable, the intent transparent. She explained the statistics that accompanied the maps. How 90% of searches targeted minority residents, how arrests from these stops disproportionately fell upon black citizens, how white drivers were waved through without question. Each figure was a nail in the coffin of excuses that Davis and Langford had relied upon for so long. The next layer of evidence came in sound. Recordings played across the speakers, the voices of Davis and Miller unmistakable as they spoke of higher yield in Eastbridge, as they instructed officers to find reasons for arrests even when none existed. The words were damning not only for their content, but for their casual tone, the way injustice had become routine, expected, normalized. And then came the voice of Langford, caught in a meeting where he described the checkpoints as a tool not for safety, but for maintaining property values, for keeping what he called the element contained. His words hung in the air like a toxin, impossible to deny, impossible to justify. Langford shifted in his seat, sweat beading at his temples. He attempted to interject, to frame the statements as taken out of context, but Amara's composure silenced him more effectively than any interruption could. She reminded him that the recordings were unaltered, their timestamps intact, their authenticity verified. His protests faded into murmurs, his carefully constructed facade unraveling before everyone present. Detective Rafael Ortiz then stepped forward, his files in hand, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was revealing. He detailed how he had observed irregularities, how his attempts to file complaints had been buried, how he had been reassigned when he asked too many questions. He presented the internal memos he had collected, the statistical analyses he had compiled, the performance reviews that tied officer evaluations to quotas targeting Eastbridge residents. He showed emails marked resolved that had never been investigated, evidence deleted from archives, witness statements altered to suit the narrative. His testimony carried not only the strength of evidence, but the quiet force of integrity, the courage of a man who had chosen principle over silence. The atmosphere in the room grew heavier with each revelation. Davis's face drained of color as video footage contradicted his reports. Miller's eyes darted nervously as his own words played back at him. Langford leaned forward, desperate to spin, but his voice carried less weight with every attempt. The evidence spoke louder than excuses. Amara's final presentation was the most devastating. Financial documents lit up the projection screen, tracing contributions from developers to Langford's accounts, detailing the coordinated effort to depress property values in Eastbridge through systemic harassment. The checkpoints had never been about safety. They had been about money, power, and displacement. Families were meant to be driven out, their homes bought for pennies, their neighborhood carved up for profit. The cruelty of it was laid bare, undeniable. As the evidence closed in, silence fell across the room. For the first time in months, perhaps years, those who had orchestrated the injustice faced something they could not dismiss, intimidate, or bury. They faced the truth, wielded with precision, reinforced by authority, recorded for history. Amara looked across the table at them, her gaze unwavering. They had treated her as though she were nothing more than an inconvenience, a resident to be silenced. Now they understood who she truly was, not simply a general, but a representative of every voice they had tried to suppress. When dawn broke over Greenfield, the police station was surrounded not by quiet indifference, but by vehicles from federal agencies, by journalists gathering with cameras, by residents who had heard whispers of what had happened through the night. Inside, indictments were prepared, charges outlined, and suspects escorted under guard. Langford's attempts to call his attorney were met with firm hands guiding him back into the room. Davis and Miller were separated from their fellow officers, their futures no longer in their own control. The program they had used to terrorize Eastbridge was dismantled in a matter of hours, its remnants now evidence in federal hands. In the days that followed, hearings were scheduled, press conferences held, and the story spread across the nation. Amara testified before Congress, presenting the full scope of what had been uncovered. She spoke not as a victim, but as a witness, a protector, a leader determined to ensure that no community would face the same systemic oppression again. Legislators listened as she recommended reforms, independent oversight of checkpoints, mandatory demographic reporting, and enforceable consequences for departments that violated civil rights. Her words carried the weight of someone who had not only studied the problem, but endured it. Detective Ortiz sat in the audience during her testimony, acknowledged for his role in bringing evidence forward. The applause that followed was not just for him, but for every person who had chosen to stand against corruption. He accepted it with humility, his eyes lowered, but inside he felt the shift, the knowledge that silence no longer defined him. His brother's case, along with countless others, was now under review. Back in Eastbridge, the change was felt in quieter, more profound ways. The checkpoints were gone, their barricades dismantled, their presence erased from the roads. Families drove without fear, children walked to school without the shadow of harassment. The community, once suffocated by constant scrutiny, began to breathe again. The Cole family store became a gathering place once more, filled with customers and conversation, no longer dampened by the weight of fear. Amara returned there one evening, sitting quietly in the back as her mother arranged the shelves. Neighbors came to thank her, their gratitude simple but genuine. One elderly woman told her that her grandson, who had lost his scholarship after a false arrest, now had his record cleared and had returned to his studies. Stories like his multiplied, each one a thread in the fabric of renewal. Amara listened, humbled, knowing that while the battle was not over, a corner had been turned. Ellie Cole embraced her daughter, her hands lingering with the tenderness of someone who had always known her child was destined for more. The store smelled the same as it always had, but now it carried a different air, a lightness that had been absent for too long. Amara felt the weight of responsibility still upon her, but it was no longer the crushing weight of solitary duty. It was shared, carried by a community rising again. Justice had not been perfect, nor had it been swift, but it had come, carved out through discipline, through truth, through the refusal to bow. And in that justice lay the promise of something greater, the possibility of a nation where dignity was not determined by an address, where law did not bend to prejudice, where rights were not negotiable. As Amara looked out the window of the store at the streets of Eastbridge, she saw people walking freely, laughter returning to corners once silenced. It was a sight she carried with her as both victory and reminder. The system had been broken, but it had also been forced to confront itself. The fight for equality was not over, but the path forward was clearer. And for Amara Cole, the general who had once sat silently in a cell, waiting for the clock to turn, that was enough to know her mission was far from finished. If this story kept you watching, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to check out our other videos for more powerful stories still to come. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too important to keep to yourself.